I'm here today with Jemar Tisby. Jamar is a graduate of the University of Notre Dame and has an MDiv from Reformed Theological Seminary. He's the CEO of The Witness, a Black Christian collective, which is an organization dedicated to Black uplift. He's also co-host of the Pass the Mic podcast and the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Color of Compromise. He's spoken nationwide at conferences, and his writing has been featured at the Washington Post, CNN, and The Atlantic. He is also a PhD candidate in history at the University of Mississippi, studying race, religion, and social movements in the 20th century. So Jemar, it's really a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Absolutely. Glad to be a first timer here. Hopefully it's not the last. Thanks.
No, absolutely. So we also have to wish Jemar a happy book birthday because today is the release of his latest book, How to Fight Racism. And so I want to talk in length about that. But before we get to that, maybe, Jemar, you can just tell us a little bit more about your background and all the different things that you've done leading up to this.
Sure. Well, I grew up in the Midwest, North Shore, north of Chicago area, and became a Christian in high school, which has always been part of my story in terms of race and race relations as well. And went to undergrad, as you mentioned, at the University of Notre Dame, go Irish, and ended up after college in the Delta on the Arkansas side. I joined Teach for America, and that's where they placed me, and basically never left after that. It was a 2-year commitment. I was a 6th grade science and social studies teacher. I stayed on for another couple of years as a teacher, became middle school principal, grades 5 through 8. And that was my first career, which most people don't know about. So I did that for 7 or 8 years, and then went to seminary at Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson, Mississippi, which was an incredible experience being in Jackson. It has the second highest proportion of Black people of any city over 100,000 in the U.S. And so it's just a very chocolate city. And of course, it's in the deep South and in Mississippi. So there's tons of racial history there. And that's sort of where I got really enraptured by the academic study of history. Took my first graduate course in history at Jackson State University, which is a historically Black college. And then from there applied and got accepted to the University of Mississippi, where I'm working on my PhD, like you said, studying race and religion and social movements. But all of that background sort of led up to my first book, The Color of Compromise, which was a historical survey of the white U.S. church complicity in racism. And then the second book, How to Fight Racism, is sort of builds on that first. They can be read independently of each other, but it gets to the more practical steps, the what do we do, how do we do it kind of stuff.
I mean, let's talk about the first book a little bit, a little bit more if we could. Why do you think that became as successful as it was?
Yeah, so what's interesting about it is The Color of Compromise came out January 2019, and it only hit the New York Times bestseller list in June of 2020.
Oh, wow.
So a year and a half later, which is very rare.
Yes.
If a book hits the bestseller list, usually in the first week or two of publication. So the book had done very well, relatively speaking, already. And I was speaking at a lot of venues, mainly Christian colleges and universities. So there was already this interest. And I think there's a momentum really in the past decade. You can go back to Trayvon Martin. And then a year after that is when the phrase Black Lives Matter came into the world at the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's killer. And then the year after that, August 2014, was the killing of Mike Brown, when the whole world learned about the Black Lives Matter hashtag, and that became sort of the banner of this phase of the Black freedom struggle. So there's already a momentum there, an interest where race is a topic of national conversation. And what I noticed in the literature around race and racism, particularly geared toward Christians, was there were already a good number of books starting to be published on the topic. Most of them I found were psychological, sociological, or kind of memoir accounts. And all of them touched on history, because you can't really talk about race without talking a little bit about the past. But none of them really took history or historical study as the central vehicle to drive their point. And so that's where The Color of Compromise came in. It's a historical survey from the colonial era on up to the present day Black Lives Matter movement, 21st century. And what I wanted to do was show all the ways that the church, and particularly white Christians, had missed it when it came to racial justice in the US. And I think what resonated was that it was all in one place, and that a lot of this history was history people may have heard about but didn't really know the details of. And so to really dig into it, I get messages to this day about people saying, I never knew, this is paradigm shifting for me. And just that awareness of where we've been and how we got here has shifted people's perspectives in a good way.
Wow. Well, it's a great book, and it's had a lot of impact, which, is just wonderful to see. So tell us then how that led to the new book.
Yeah, so I tell people, The Color of Compromise is 11 chapters long, and the first 10 chapters are all a setup to get to the last chapter. And the last chapter is called The Fierce Urgency of Now, which is a phrase Martin Luther King Jr. used in his I Have a Dream speech. And, most of us, we jump to the end of that speech about, being judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. But in the beginning of that speech, he really reads America, the Riot Act, and talks about how the U.S. has failed in its promise of democracy and liberty for all. And he uses this phrase, the fierce urgency of now, to talk about how in 1963, the time is long past to make the promises of democracy real for all people, particularly people of African descent. Now, I just love that phrase, and unfortunately, I think it's still relevant even, half a century later. So that last chapter of The Color of Compromise is about what do we do? How do we respond to the fierce urgency of now? And because the central focus of the book was that historical survey, I could really only spend a chapter on it in the book. But really, my passion was to ignite people and motivate people toward action. And so if The Color of Compromise is the diagnosis, then How to Fight Racism is more like a prescription. What do we do to alleviate this malady, so to speak? So it's an entire book that prioritizes the practical and is hopefully very hands-on and helpful for people to actually start taking action.
That's really cool. I mean, as you and I were discussing before we started the interview, I feel that there's such a void of that right now.
Right.
A very practical, okay, what do we do about this? I mean, it's pretty ridiculous that, Martin Luther King gave that speech in 1963, right? I mean, and here we are in 2021. And, it's like, it's just hard to believe that we still are where we are,
right.
After all that time. I mean, I know that's after hundreds of years before that too, but I mean, at least the 63 part of it's within my own lifetime.
Yes.
So I've unfortunately been able to experience the lack of progress.
Right.
So talk about some of the practical elements of how to fight racism, what you've included in that book.
So I think what's unique about this book is the framework that I use, which structures the entire book. And it's a model I've been developing called the Arc of Racial Justice. And ARC is an acronym that stands for Awareness, Relationships, Commitment. What I found in a lot of the literature and work on racial justice is that people tend to sort of gravitate toward particular areas, which are all good, helpful, necessary, but almost like a two-legged stool, it's going to be pretty unstable. You don't want to sit on that too long or too frivolously. So the arc of racial justice, I think, brings in all the elements we need to build a robust, stable platform on which to build efforts for racial justice. And so it's pretty self-explanatory. Awareness is all of the knowledge, the data, the information we need to know about race, racism, white supremacy in order to understand what we're dealing with. And so awareness, we sort of gravitate toward that as kind of the lowest hanging fruit in terms of, these are the books we read, the documentaries we watch, the podcast interviews we listen to. anything that sort of informs us about these issues is the awareness part. But we can't just stop there and have big heads full of knowledge. We got to do something with it. We got to have big hearts too. And so I think one of the conversations, I think there's almost been an overcorrection in terms of the relationship aspect. If I could just riff on this a little bit. So the big tension in racial justice is whether the problems are individual or systemic, right? Are cases of police brutality, for instance, is that fundamentally about, you know, this particular police officer who's a bad actor, or this particular encounter that may be unique or exceptional, or is it part of a larger systemic issue, a pattern that has replicated itself for decades, right? So that's a big tension and a big divide. Obviously, as a historian, as a Black person who's experienced this stuff, I think the problems are systemic, beyond simply the isolated incident itself. But I think there's almost been an overcorrection in that, as we're trying to change the systemic aspect, the policies, the laws, the practices, et cetera, we all of a sudden sort of say relationships aren't important at all. And I think we need to have those two in conversation with one another. So that, what do I mean? You know, the paradox with white Christians and white evangelicals in particular is they are hyper individualistic, partly as a result of their theology, you know, this very sort of one-on-one relationship with Jesus, just me and my Bible kind of a thing. And that ekes out into the ways they understand issues of racism. It's issues of personal prejudice and bigotry. So the solution is conversion. You change people one heart at a time, kind of a thing. Well, obviously that doesn't work on a systemic level. It doesn't change mass incarceration, voter suppression, you know, death penalty, things like that. You got to work on a systemic level. At the same time, how do you get people who are hyper individualistic to start thinking systemically? And a fundamental error that we all tend to make is think that it's a matter of data and facts, and it's not. You can have a conversation with someone and stack facts from floor to ceiling. It won't change their mind. The paradox is that many people who think very individualistically come to understand the systemic problems through a relationship. So it's when I know someone well and I tell them the stories of my encounters with police. And since they know Jemar and they know what kind of person I am, and I'm real to them, and they hear these stories, now they are a little bit more attentive to what I'm saying. It doesn't work in all cases, but they're a little bit more open. So point being, we always need relationships, and part of it is persuasion, but even beyond that, I think there's a human element to it. If we stay so distant from people that they simply become the other or the enemy or the problem, then we actually start to become part of a problem. It does something to our own hearts, I think, to categorize people according simply to their ideology or who we think they are. And so we need to constantly be reaching out across racial and ethnic and cultural lines to know people. I know that sounds soft and wishy-washy, but here's the thing. The commitment aspect gets to that policy part, gets to that law part, because we can have all the heart-to-heart conversations and share all the cups of coffee at Starbucks we want, but it's not going to change the fact that Black women are dying at three times the rate of white women in maternity-related deaths. All the pulpit swaps and, you know, church choir swaps or whatever you want to do, that's not going to do a thing about the fact that, you know, Black men are likely to end up in the criminal justice system at a rate of 1 in 3 as compared to a rate of 1 in 17 for white men. So what do we do about that stuff, the systemic and the structural issues? And so I talk about how, you know, we need to work on these broader levels of policies and practices in order to see real change. And so the whole book is structured around that arc of racial justice. Each chapter has a section called Essential Understandings, where I give some of the framework and background. And then the bulk of the chapter is called Racial Justice Practices, where I just list and explain different things that we can do in each of these categories: awareness, relationships, commitment.
Well, one of the other, to your point about relationships, and one of the other folks that I was interviewing for the series um, had said that their data showed that 75% of American white people don't have any kind of a meaningful relationship with
Yes.
an African American person.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
if that's the case, how do you, you know, right? I mean, you said that's just the starting point. But I mean,
Right. Right.
the fact that that starting point hasn't even been,
Right.
reached
And
is
it's a
like,
massive problem because it speaks to so many of the systemic issues that make these issues of racism intractable. So why is it that 75% of white people have a social network that's basically entirely white or doesn't have any meaningful relationship? Well, that's partially related to where you live, which is related to redlining and residential segregation. That segregation residentially leads to school segregation, which is as bad or worse as it was in the 1950s. And that school segregation means your kids, your children are growing up in homogenous environments. That also means that the access to resources and wealth is concentrated in certain areas and among certain people groups. That means our churches, where that famous adage, 11 o'clock a.m. on Sunday morning, is the most segregated hour in America. Well, what's happening on Sunday is downstream from what's happening Monday through Saturday. And so this idea of relationships gets at those systemic and institutional issues as well, because it's not by accident. The U.S. has demonstrated incredible ingenuity at keeping white people separated from black people. And that's going to take some intentionality to reach beyond those walls that have been purposely built up.
I'm really glad that you included the C portion, the third portion of, your model, because, it's one thing for us to talk about it, but unless we actually do something, it's just like, okay, this is just going to continue to fester. And it'll be another 50 years or whatever, just like, from 1963,
Yeah.
and we'll be in the same boat as we are now, unless we start trying to deal with these issues that, are centuries overdue for dealing.
Well, I think my guess, because the book just came out, so we'll see what it looks like in action. But if number one, it very much lends itself to a group study where you can go through the book. But what I also hope that these groups do, I'd recommend going through the book in about 6 weeks. But I'd spend another couple of weeks meeting to talk about action steps and to say, okay, now that we've read all this, what are we as a group, church, book study, whatever it's going to be, what are we actually going to do? And I think that's going to be really interesting, because you can have a group of people who can all agree racism is a problem. It's been a problem historically. There are systemic issues taking place. But I think where the conversation is going to really get interesting is when you talk about what to do about it, because then you're going to get, gradualists versus, radicals. Then you're going to get people who want to work on, incarceration versus education. I think that's going to lead to some really fruitful discussion. And there's going to be a dynamic there that wasn't present when you're simply reading or studying about the problem or the issue. Now that you're trying to come up with solutions. So if you think back to the civil rights movement, there were at least a dozen major organizations that were working on civil rights, and all of them had a different emphasis and focus. You had the Southern Christian Leadership Conference that was doing nonviolent direct action. You had the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was doing really grassroots work in difficult places like Mississippi, registering people to vote. You had organizations like the NAACP, which were interracial and working on a law and a legal strategy to change things. So I think we're ready for that now. I think these organizations already exist, but it's going to be really interesting when people who have agreed on pretty much everything else as far as diagnosing the issue of racism are now going to have different emphases. And I think that's good and healthy, but it's going to be something to work through.
Well, as you said, each one of those different areas of focus is so big and difficult in and of itself.
Right. That's right.
That unless we, kind of attack them all individually, nothing will happen.
Yeah, and so it'll be a question of priorities, skill sets, social and geographic location that groups are going to have to determine. where, how, and when they can work. So, but I'm eager because I hope this book is what I say in the introduction. I hope it's a exercise in prophetic imagination. So my burden in this book isn't that you would take my exact, recommendations. It's that you would, maybe it spurs another idea that I didn't put in the book or didn't even think of. That's great. Go for it and do it. The point is action. The point is to take steps. The point is to get beyond the book study, as important as that is, but to actually go out and make the world a better place by your actions.
What a concept. As we talked about beforehand, I mean, I'm so with you 100% on that. For people who are not familiar with the Witness BCC and the Pass the Mic podcast, can you talk a little bit more about those?
Yes. So we're in a dynamic phase of the organization. We recently expanded. And so we are the Witness Incorporated, and that is the umbrella organization for our two divisions. One is the Black Christian Collective, and the other is our brand new division, the Witness Foundation. And so basically you can think of these divisions as sort of the word and deed tandem. So what the Black Christian Collective does, it's basically a multimedia organization that tries to put words to the expansive Black Christian experience. One of the things we say at the BCC is we're not the voice, we're the microphone. And so we're not trying to present this sort of univocal voice of Black Christians. We want to emphasize that there's diversity within Black Christianity, and there are many voices that ought to be heard. What we're trying to do is build a platform for Black Christian voices to be heard. So we do that through our website, thewitnessbcc.com, and we have blogs up there. We have videos, and we're expanding our offerings all the time there. What we also have is a podcast called Pass the Mic, which I co-host with my good friend and brother, Tyler Burns. So that is a really dynamic conversation about current events, theology, Black church, all of that. So that's the BCC side, which has been around for a while. The new division that we added is the Witness Foundation. We are in the middle of a fundraising campaign. We're trying to raise $500,000 because the cornerstone of the foundation is our fellowship program. And so in the summer of 2021, we are going to launch our first cohort of Witness Fellows. And these are Black Christian leaders who are doing dynamic justice work. Can be in any area, education, law, economics, you name it. And what we want to do is invest in the next generation of Black Christian leaders. And so to that end, part of the fellowship is they get a $50,000 grant each year for 2 years. So a total of $100,000 investment in a Black Christian leader. And it's unrestricted funds. And so you can use that for anything you think will increase your organization's impact. But we set that bar high. So I'm in academia. If you apply for a grant, the most generous grants are maybe $20,000, $25,000. And so this is really premium level funding that we're doing here. And the reason why we wanted to do that is because we wanted it to be a transformative amount. So that a lot of people like me, and when I started the Witness in fall of 2011, it's just me and a laptop and a Facebook page, right? And we didn't have a budget. We didn't have venture capital. We didn't have anything of that. And so we set that amount at $50,000 because we wanted to say, look, if you wanted to quit your job, your day job, and do this thing full time, it would perhaps be feasible for you. And that's the kind of commitment, that's the kind of financial investment we need to make in Black Christian leaders who are already doing incredible work. But because of the historic racial wealth gap, a lack of access to capital, a lack of access to the people and the networks that can build that capital, we just have had to do more with less. And what we've been able to accomplish at places like, say, the Witness, without any appreciable funding is incredible. Now, just imagine if we could do that with the actual resources we need. And that's the kind of impact we're trying to make. So we're starting
cool.
This fellowship.
Cool. It's like, the epitome of entrepreneurship, right? Get somebody launched.
Yes.
And give them, tremendous support, over a 2-year period is really generous, to get something launched.
And in addition to that, you're going to get a mentor that you can talk with one-on-one. You're also going to get training, bringing in high-level people with professional skills from accounting to fundraising to leadership to nonprofit management. And you're going to get these. I mean, you're running your own company. And so a lot of us, though, we're starting out of passion, we're starting out of mission, but we don't necessarily have those, business skills that we need to scale an organization. So we want to invest in these leaders, not just financially, but also in terms of their skill development so that they can build a sustainable organization and increase their impact.
Wow, that's really exciting. And, I'll really look forward to seeing the results of that. What are the different kinds of efforts that spawn out of that?
Yeah, listen, we're getting the application period for this year just closed. We've got literally dozens of applications, and the hardest part is going to be choosing, which ones to fund, because there's so many great ones. And I am thrilled because I think folks are going to be blown away by the caliber of Black Christian leaders that we have. And they're already doing good work. But once we can support them at the levels we're talking about, these people are going to be nationally known. I have no doubt.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, this is just the beginning, and folks can support. You can just go to thewitnessinc.com, and it'll have links for folks who want to support.
Well, if any of those folks end up wanting to do a book and need help finding a publisher, I think Publishing in Color might be able to help them out with
Very good.
So
Absolutely.
Please put them in touch with me on that front.
That sounds good.
Well, Jemar, it's really a pleasure to spend time with you. Thank you so much for all the wonderful work that you're doing. I'm very much looking forward to reading this new book. And, I wish you the best luck with that and, the Witness in its various endeavors.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the space to have this conversation.
Well, it's really great to be able to talk together, Jemar, and we'll help get the word out.
Sounds good. Thank you.